The first time I saw the town, it was a ripple on the horizon, a mirage of rectangles and ribs of concrete floating above the bleaching basin of the Amargosa. My map called it Rhyolite, Nevada, an abandoned mining town older than the last 100 summers I've wasted behind glass. I had chased dozens of ruined towns across the West, the kind that were born with a bell and died with a whistle, but Rhyolite had something the others didn't. It had a photograph I didn't know how to take yet, and it had a light I hadn't earned. The road in was a washboard that rattled my teeth and shook the tripod in its case. Wind combed the creosote. Beer glass glitter shivered across the gravel shoulders like a low-tide constellation. When I killed the engine, the world kept hissing, as if the desert had been waiting to tell me what it thought of internal combustion. A bottle house squatted at the edge of the grid, its walls green-brown and frozen with the last laughter of some barfly mason. Beyond it, a schoolhouse shell, a bank with windows that were holes. A row of foundations like teeth knocked out of a jaw. I clocked the sun. 4 hours until it frothed itself against the western ridgeline. That meant I had time to wander and decide where the shot would live. I walked until my boots remembered stones. I swung the camera from my neck and let the lens eye the town. The depot lintel and its carved date, 1906. The concrete ribs of the cook bank clawing at the heat. 100 fences gone to air. Their gateposts the only proof anyone had tried to keep anything. The desert pressed against the grid in a patient siege, sending in scouts of sand through every gap. The boarded window was part of a long, low building that might have been a boarding house or the cheap hotel where the quick money boys learned to snore like bosses. Most of the windows were empty mouths. One was gagged with planks, hammered tight in a hurry long after the town had stopped caring. Something about the boards made me itch. They weren't the gray of old wood weathered into grace. They were newer, as if someone had tried to deny admission to the last 100 years. The heads of the nails winked like little buried coins. I set up across the street, triangulating. Heat whirled the air. A distant hum named itself as a truck on the highway a few miles off. Then let the desert eat its name. Through the viewfinder, the boarded window sat stubbornly off-center, the way an honest subject refuses to pose. I bracketed exposures. I tried small aperture for the deep stab of the shadows, then wide open for the way the edges gulped the light. Sweat beaded my jaw and dried instantly. My lips tasted like a battery. By the time I had circled the block twice, the sun had leveled and the wind changed its story. The day's brass went to pewter. Heat sank. The shadows lengthened like pulling taffy. And though I told myself I was a city boy trained to fear any sky without light pollution, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was 12 and my cousin locked me in the root cellar at my grandfather's farm. A certainty that something would be there when the door opened. I ate in the car with the door open, listening to the wind rummage through the broken rooms. I had left the tripod up. The air was calm and there was no one to steal it except the town. Night crept down the hills on its belly. The bank ribs went black. The desert unrolled its cold. Stars came on as if a switch had been pulled in a very large room. I clicked the headlamp once to find the lens cap, then snapped it off. I didn't want a cone of my own light making a place on me. That was when the boarded window began to glow. It wasn't an honest light. It was a sickle slip, a jaundiced seeping from between the planks. It pulsed once as though something inside had remembered what breathing was. I stood without meaning to. My first thought was a squatter running a candle. My second was a prank, a battery lantern left to spook the ruined tourists. My third thought was slower and had to be dragged up from somewhere old. You found a light in the dark because it was a promise, and you walked to it because you were still, despite everything, a person. I took 4 photographs from where I stood, long exposures that inhaled starlight. The glow recorded as a wound. Then I moved closer, counting steps not for any superstition but because numbers felt like rails I could hold. The wind had calmed. Sand ticked like a very quiet clock under my soles. From 20 feet, the glow was the same sour yellow I associated with old kitchen bulbs and the nostrils of jackrabbits hit by car beams. From 10 feet, the planks made a crosshatch, and the glow slotted itself in like an organ behind ribs. "Hello?" I said, because someone in me had been raised that way. The glow paused. The wind forgot itself. I heard the hush of my own blood in the bones around my ears. That pause contained such absolute attention that I realized, with a cold that belonged to winter, that the light had always been waiting for the sound of my voice. The pause wasn't surprise. It was gratitude. Boards don't answer, but the space between them did. A whisper of air, cool, threaded out and touched my lips. It smelled like old plaster and something sweet and wrong, like a peach fermenting in a desk drawer. Somewhere in the building, a piece of tin shifted or a mouse dragged a history across dust. I saw movement in the slit. Literal movement. A darker thing passing in front of the glow and blotting a part of it before letting it flow back together. I understood without quite the sense for it that the light was watching me watch it. I lifted the camera. My hand shook. I shot blind through the boards with the lens hood kissing the wood. The shutter worked with its soft guillotine sound. While the camera thought, I leaned on the siding, feeling how the building kept its chill inside it. As if the desert had failed to cook out what mattered, the whisper came again. Not air this time, but syllables. And the words were nonsense until they weren't. Don't. I stepped back hard enough to find the curb with my heel. The camera finished and beeped its idiot cheer. I turned the preview into life and saw a smear of light and a suggestion of a face that was nothing more than pattern recognition cruelty, but still I felt the old guttering candle of belief lift. Don't open it, the whisper said. The boards did not move. The glow thinned as if embarrassed. I wasn't, I said, which was a lie I had convinced myself to believe a second before it became necessary. Who are you? Silence moved from wall to wall. The glow sickled. If it had had a throat, it would have swallowed. I was him, it said finally. I was the last one to believe. The wind came back then with a vindictive slap, and I stepped closer to hear. The voice wasn't coming from the slit so much as stapled to the light. It was a sound you would only hear if you were already looking. The more I tried to own it with rules, the less it sounded like anything human. There's a door around back, I said, and I hated myself the way you hate the person in a video who chooses the wrong hallway. If you need help, the hush shuddered. Please, it said, and the words sagged under the weight of a century. Please, I walked the side yard. In the camera strap, I felt the tremor of my cat's cradle of choices. The back of the building opened into a lot where weeds broke the geometry, a rectangle where a cistern had sunk, a scatter of boards that had once been something with purpose. A door stood like a man leaning, and it had been nailed shut and then ripped open, the latter in a hurry. Something had tried to keep something in or out. I remember thinking that it would be useful to decide which, but the thought slid off the cold that found me. I put my palm on the wood. It was cold. I put my shoulder to the door, and the top hinge burped a powder of rust. The gap went from fist to hip to step, and I pushed through. Dust lifted and hung in a room that had been a dining hall or a dormitory. The floor had the list of a drunk. At the far end, I could see the boarded window from the inside. The glow was indeed seeping in, not out. The boards were bright on their edges, as if going char from a fire that could not be seen. Where are you? I said, and then, because I didn't like how I sounded, I've got a light. Don't, it said, and the word was knife sharp. If you show them where you are, they remember faster. Who's them? Silence. Wind. A tick like cooling engine metal, but the kind the desert doesn't make. I stood until my own heart had to cough. Then I raised the headlamp anyway, thumbed it on low and let the cone walk the room. Dust motes spun like the small, slow lives of other things. The beam lapped a long table, the ghosts of plates outlined in powder. The beam found a chair tilted as if someone had stood fast and done something forever. The beam found a wall with a calendar nailed to it. October 1909, the days crossed out with a pencil-like iron filings. One date was circled so hard the paper had bruised. They met at night, the not-quite voice said. They said the heat wouldn't kill a man if work had. They said light was money in the air. They bet an evening on a light to prove there was a shine left in the ground. My thumb eased the headlamp dimmer until the room was close to dark again. I felt better almost at once, as if I'd stopped pointing at myself. At the boarded window, the glow seemed to notice me, and I had the childlike conviction that light could look back. In the floor, under the window, a square had been cut and replaced roughly, like an old trapdoor or a hatch built by someone who feared about more than they knew how to name. I squatted and touched it. The wood was colder there, the way spring water is colder than the air even in noon. They put me down there, the voice said mildly, like a man in a story trying to be funny about his own death. Not quick, not yet. First, they told me what the light would want. You said you were him, I said, keeping my mouth small so the room would have to come closer to hear. Who's him? A draft curled under the hatch and touched my wrist. I had the strangest reflex to have my camera ready as if there would be proof. I lifted the square. It came up with a soft bark, then a harder tear where the nails had rethought their commitment. The smell that came up belonged to a place that words didn't go. It had mineral in it. It had breath in it. It had a sweetness so strong it flipped into rot in the back of my throat. The headlamp gave a low, sour cone down a ladder whose rungs had been chewed by old water. "The ledger says he owed men up and down the block," the voice said, as if still trying to keep me on a gentler road. "But the light doesn't care about sums. It cares about who will look longest. It eats attention like bread." "I'm not going down," I said to the ladder, to the cold, to the glow that reached as if air could lean. My voice sounded like I had already decided to compromise. "What do you want?" No answer. The quiet changed, though. The old wood stopped making wood sounds. Something that had been absent arrived. It did not enter so much as remember that it had been here before there were walls. The glow brightened by the thinness of a breath. My headlamp flickered without religion. The ladder creaked. Then down in the space, something with a tiny sound of cotton lifting moved from left to right. "I didn't want anything," the voice said. And there was a smile now, flat as frost. "I wanted to go home to Beatty with the rest of them. I wanted to tell my sister I'd pay her back. I wanted to stop needing light. They said if I stayed still, the light would learn me. They said if I looked with it, I'd see where the ore went. They said if I went down, it would be quick. But quick is a city word. Quick takes trains. The desert has its own clocks. He who had been him was not telling me to help anymore. He was preparing me, like a man making a place at a table. I closed the hatch. It settled with a compliant sigh. I put my palm on it. The cold came up like a coin pressed into skin. In the hallway, a door moved as if a hand were on it. I told myself wind. The headlamp died and the room didn't get darker because the boarded window was brighter. Enough now that the slats threw shadows the width of fingers across my chest. I could see my own breath. It left me like the tail of a moth and vanished. Outside, the desert was still summer, but in this cold room something shifted seasons without asking. I backed toward the door I had shouldered in. The light thinned a little in the manner of a smile dropping. I took one more photograph pointlessly in the dark. The flash went off with a ridiculous bravado and showed me a room that didn't think much of my tricks. In that strobed moment, I saw on the far wall the missing bell of a church painted in chalk, as if someone had been counting nights. I went back to the car. I made myself drive 2 miles to the highway and then another 5 because I didn't want the town to see where I slept. In the morning, the valley was a plate again, and rhyolite looked like something that had happened to the land rather than something men had made. I told myself I had enough shots to please the magazine that sometimes paid for my gasoline and barely for my time. I told myself the glow had been a battery lantern and a bar of dying lithium. I told myself to keep driving. At the gas station in Beatty, the clerk had a tattoo of a scorpion on her forearm and a scar like a little dry riverbed under her eye. "Rhyolite?" she asked, handing my card back with a smile that almost did what smiles are supposed to. "You get that window?" "What window?" I said too fast. She tapped the counter 3 times. "Every fool points their camera at it," she said. "Every fool bets his night he won't. But the last light catches you if you look too long. You look long enough, you see him. He was a man went missing, name on the wall of the post office. Some say they found him. All bones under a floor. Some say that was another man. Some say the light eats names and leaves the rest moving. I went back that afternoon because I am a fool for a subject that resists my lens. The desert smelled like penny heat and things that had been dry too long. A vulture worked circles over the far ridge like a slow clock's hand. I promised myself the second night would be different. The camera would stay in the bag. I would treat the boarded window like traffic, noticed and ignored. I set up north of the bank ruins and let the long lens suck distance flat. I documented shadow down the ribbed concrete, the way it made music with the missing panes. At dusk, I let the wind lay its cold hand on my throat again. I heard the town's quiet collect like coins in a jar. When the stars crawled out from their burrows, the boarded window lit. I kept my back to it. I let the glow live only at the edge of my eyes, a trespasser I didn't confront. This is how we live in cities. We pretend for safety that we do not see. The glow pulsed when I looked while not looking. It lengthened its breath to match mine. It learned the clock of my body. "Don't," the voice said finally, not from the boards but from the piece of air by my left shoulder. I turned so hard the camera strap bit my throat. Nothing stood there except the matched moons of my own breath. The glow had intensified to the pale of old teeth. It cast bars across the dust like the inside of a cell. "Don't have to fight it," the voice said, kind, the way a tired man can be kind after the argument is lost. "You can let it take the part of you that wants it." "What does it want?" I said, and my voice misfired on the last word, turning want into wandered. "It wants you to admit you need it," he said. "It wants to be the last light you see. It wants you to look until what you are is a way of looking." "I won't," I said. I stood up. I took one step and felt the ground teach me gravity. I took another and found I had walked without planning toward the low building. The glow widened in welcome. The boards revealed their old splinters and their fresher scars. A nail had been bent and hammered flat by a hand that knew how to deny a future. I put my fingers to the seam. The wood's cold married the bones of my hand. I realized then with a plainness that I had not been followed by a voice, I had been led by it. My head found the boards with a small penitent tap. Through the slit I could see motion, but the word motion was wrong. It was the way the eye sees the heat in July, cedar oil and water, 4-lane night behind a bug-smeared windshield. I understood finally that the light did not come from inside the building, and not from below it, and not from the sky crawling over it, but from a place that the building touched the way skin touches a mirror. It was an echo of something that had never been sound. It had no source, only a hunger. "I didn't open it," I said, a child reciting the day's defense. "I won't go down." "You don't have to," he said. "It got me when I ran. It got me when I promised my sister and lied. It gets you most clean when you stay. When you say you'll only stay a little. When you want to see the exact shape." The door around back opened without my hand. I heard it in the place behind my heart. I walked without meaning to. The stars moved overhead as if on pulleys. The wind quit again as if scolded. The door waited with the patience of a predator with no need to hurry. I pushed it with one finger and stepped inside. The cold molded to me like a second shirt. The boards of the window glowed like the bones of some animal in a museum when the guide's laser pointer sweeps. The hatch under the window breathed. "You can still go," he said, with the sad generosity of a man who has watched 10 men make and unmake the same mistake. "If you leave now, you'll dream about the shape of the light, and you'll come back because the dream will be wrong in a way reality never is. What happens if I stay? You'll become part of the proof," he said. "They'll point their cameras at you. They'll get a smear and call it a face. They'll say the desert holds on to men the way salt holds to your lips. You'll be in the ledger the way all of us are." "How many?" I asked, and I didn't know what number I hoped for. He laughed, a sound like 2 coins collapsing into one in a pocket. "Enough that the town doesn't forget how to be a town," he said. "Not enough to keep any promises." I sat on the floor because my legs had invented sitting. The hatch shifted. I felt the pull of the place under it. Not the physical tug of gravity, but the suggestion of an idea that wouldn't leave you alone. The glow inside the slats pulsed and pulsed until the pulses in my heart combined into a single, untranslatable machine. I put my hand on the hatch and the cold climbed my arm. It reached my shoulder and began to bridegroom itself to the cords of my neck. I thought of my apartment, the plant that always leans toward the one honest window like a woman waiting at a train platform, the coffee rings on the counter that map the ways I fail to clean, the stack of magazines I pretend not to care about. I thought of a woman I had nearly loved last winter and the way her photograph stayed warmer than the memory of her shoulder. I thought of light, sodium and halogen, moon and screen, the way a lens wants all of it. I thought of the photo I hadn't known how to take, the one that would forgive me for coming here and make it worth whatever I had already given. "Please," he said again, and in it was every way that word can be cruel. The hatch rose an inch by itself, or else the floor settled under my weight and made the illusion. Enough. Enough to let the air from below slip up and take my throat gently in its hands. In that breath's cold, I smelled the exact October when a calendar on the wall had started to be wrong. I smelled the sour of a frightened man. I smelled the faint, foxing floral of a woman's handkerchief, folded in a pocket that would never move again. I bent over the hatch as a man bends over a sink. Light climbed through the cracks like a frost coming backwards. When the ledger opens, and it always opens, even when no hand touches it, the light is the ink. Attention is the pen. The first word it writes is your name, and then it writes down everything you owe to everything you have loved. It writes and writes until the sums behave. That is how it claimed the last man, and the man before and the man before. That is how it counted out the nights of a town and learned to speak through wood. That is how it owns a window made of boards that never stop being newer than they should be. If I tell you I left, it would be because I want to be the kind of man who deserves to have left. If I tell you I stayed, it would be to spare you the part where I haven't learned yet how to be anything else. In the desert, you learn that both can be true because the same horizon gives you morning and night if you stand still. What I can say is this. In the morning, someone will photograph the boarded window. They will tell themselves they are only taking a picture of old wood and a cheap effect. They will go home to their screens and their rooms and their plants that learn the same light every day. But when they sleep, a rectangle will glow on the inside of their eyelids in a color too tired to be gold. Rhyolite keeps its address the way any ghost does, by being the last place you looked. I found the Ash Springs Motel after the highway ran out of confidence and narrowed into two grudging lanes that pretended to be a road. The sun had just tipped behind the Badlands, bleeding the desert into copper and bruise, and my gaslight blinked like a tired eye. The town that the billboard promised, Ash Springs next right, was a congregation of hollow buildings and a wind so dry it scraped the back of my throat. Beyond the shell of a diner and a boarded schoolhouse hunched the motel, a strip of rooms done in a blistered turquoise that had once believed it was the color of the sky. The vacancy sign flickered the way old eyelids do when sleep is a rumor. The office blinds were half closed and already dusty at the edges, where the day had gathered and laid down. The office door wasn't locked. A brass bell sat on the counter with a crown of cigarette burns around it, where someone had ground out their impatience again and again. The room smelled like paper warmed by the sun, and the stale exhale of smoke that had married itself into the curtains. A fly traced a slow orbit beneath the ceiling fan, which didn't turn. On the wall hung a framed photograph of the motel taken decades ago. The paint was brighter, the sign honest, the lot full of cars that were all angle and optimism. The desert behind it was the same desert, patient and fitted to the horizon like a jaw. There was no one at the desk. There was only the ledger, an actual guest book with a broken spine, spread open to a page so crowded with names that the lines swallowed each other. The dates rolled backward like a bad trick. Names were carved into the paper, not written. Letters incised with such pressure the pages beneath bore the ghosts of every hand. I reached for the pen in its little chain, and discovered the chain wasn't attached to a pen at all. The end was black with soot where the plastic had burned away. The bell did not ring when I tapped it. It rattled like a tooth. "Hello?" I said, because there are words that leap out of your mouth in places like that to make the place less itself. The blinds ticked in the breeze. Something in the back room decided to be still. I set 220s on the counter beside the ledger and slid the key for room 6 from a pegboard that had seen more metal than wood for many years. The tag was a rectangle of yellowed plastic with the number embossed, the edges polished by thousands of nervous thumb rubs. I wrote my name where names went, and if the paper felt resistant to skin, I told myself that was only the grain. I could have left. The tank had another 20 miles in it, maybe 30 if I coasted. But the wind came up then, a raffish slap against the glass door that rattled the bell without ringing it, and the desert night stepped over the threshold behind me. I was tired of driving. I was tired of my own thoughts. The ledger was right there, like permission. I put my fingertip against the page and followed the grooves of strangers, touching the dents of their departed names like you might touch the names on a headstone, if you wanted to be sure you were pronouncing them correctly. Outside the neon-stuttered VACANCY, I told myself I had simply missed it. I told myself a lot of things on that first night. Room 6 was at the far end where the gravel lot dissolved into a wash of pale stones and creosote. The door's paint had blistered under 10,000 days of sun. Inside, the carpet was a shade of brown invented to hide accidents. It hid nothing. Dust was ankle-deep in the corners and glittered like mica when I dragged my bag across the floor. A square of light from the parking lot lamp pressed itself against the drawn curtains, and beyond that lamp the desert went moonless and infinite. The bed was iron and creaked in a voice that had smoked for 60 years. On the nightstand, a Bible lay open to a psalm whose verses had been underlined until they were tunnels in the page. I washed my face in water that had the mineral bite of coins. On the mirror, someone had etched a heart with a key, tiny and furtive, as if embarrassed to declare any devotion here. When I opened the door again, the corridor between the rooms was a wind tunnel. The neon outside sighed its pink breath, off on off, and with every blink the motel seemed to vanish and then reappear, an optical trick that made my stomach drop. In the parking lot, a single shoe lay face down. Black leather cracked like the rest of the world. Beside it, a suitcase stood upright without a handle, as if it had walked there and then gotten tired. I slept poorly. Sleep came like a slow tide that could not quit thinking. Every time I sank, a footstep scraped the corridor and lifted me again. Not the crisp click of a heel or the committed knock of boots, but a shuffling, a dragging, the sound of someone not wanting to wake anyone and making too much noise as a result. On the other side of the thin wall, a faucet turned and turned fruitlessly. Once, at what must have been very late, the bell at the office rang exactly once, like a laugh. I told myself the wind did it. At some point, the radio in the room decided it knew a station after all, and breathed out a fragment of a song where the singer was too far from the microphone. I pressed the off button and found it already depressed. Desert sun doesn't rise so much as it flips a switch. The room grew pale, then white, then intolerable. I opened the door to heat and silence and the kind of blue sky that makes you suspect everything under it. The shoe had moved. It had rotated just a little, so that its open mouth faced my room. The suitcase had migrated 2 inches toward the office, measuring the distance like it had all the time in the world. The backpack had unzipped itself. Something black was tucked just inside, a corner of paper like a tongue. "Hello?" I called again because the desert trains you to like the sound of your own voice. Nothing answered except the fan of heat from the earth. In the office, the bell sat as it had, the cigarette's blackened circle like a crown of thorns. The ledger stood open to a new page. I didn't need to imagine the way names had been pressed into it. There were fresh indentations in the paper where a hand had just etched letters. I read them. Keith, Nora, Little J, Benito, Mrs. Howard, Paloma, the man who wouldn't. The dates were all the same. Yesterday. In the column for checked out was one word written again and again and again. Dawn. I put my finger on my own name printed in my wallet's driver's license, as if to keep it from escaping. A ring of keys hung on the pegboard behind the desk, except they didn't. My eyes miscounted them the way eyes do when they're reluctant to believe. An empty hook waited below the brass number 6. I put the counter's key there and it hung with a domestic little sound, as if I had completed some chore. Only then did I see that the photograph on the wall wasn't quite the same as last night. The picture of the motel now showed a man in the window of the office, half turned away, a cigarette in his mouth and his face blurred by glare. His presence was as natural and as impossible as a bird in a painting that has always been there once you see it. I left the office in a hurry and told myself I was not leaving because I was scared. Fear is a shape that thoughts build themselves around. It's shelter and cage both. My car started on the second turn and then died when I let off the gas. I tried again, and the engine coughed as if an uninvited guest had walked into the room of its cylinders. On the third try, the car held idle, and I clutched the wheel and did not release the brake. In my head, I pictured a map with a curl of road unspooling like a ribbon from Ash Springs to a nameless point of relief. While I was picturing this, something tapped on the passenger window. There was no one there, but the tap had been definite, the knuckle-light knock of a person whose hands could not afford to bruise. The neon sputtered, the vacancy flickering from right to left, and the desert, patient, ancient, without malice, watched what I would decide. I released the brake. I rolled forward. The shoe by my door scuffed along the gravel, keeping pace without moving. It was a mile between the motel and the highway, maybe less, maybe more. The asphalt unrolled like a dare. I got as far as the boarded schoolhouse, the one with the bell cupola that held only a rim of rust, and then the car stalled cleanly, perfectly, like a horse refusing a fence. I turned around. An hour later, I was back at the office, the bell in my hand ringing itself once and dying, and I was saying to no one, "Look, I'm just going to take a room for one more night, all right?" Shame is the handle on a lot of doors. It turns easily. The second night magnified everything from the first. The footsteps grew confident. Somewhere a woman laughed without humor. A radio drifted in and out, playing a song I almost knew in a version the wrong singer was singing. I lay on my back and thought about a life turned into a sequence of rooms that all smelled like other people's soap. I thought about the way the ledger's names had lay on the page with their bellies up, helpless, waiting to be fixed by a hand that pressed down too hard. Around 2 in the morning, I opened my door and found the shoe sitting exactly in the middle of the walkway now, blocking me like a polite bouncer. Dawn came with a tepid violet light. When I opened the door, there was a suitcase at my threshold. It wasn't the one from the ice machine, but it was its sibling. The tag read, Harper M., the plastic cloudy with age, the string an irregular twist of something that looked like sinew. I heard a scrape down the row. The child's backpack that had unzipped itself was in front of room 3, a small blue animal that had crawled from the shade. I followed its line of travel to the office and realized the gravel wore trails the way animals wear trails to a water source. All of them converged at the bell, a new page. New names, and mine now too, though I hadn't written it. My name had been scored there with care. First and last, middle initial, the loops of my vowels firm as if the hand had practiced them. The date beside it was yesterday. In the column for checked out was a time dawn. My pulse toddled in my throat like something just learning to walk. I put my thumb on the place, and when I lifted it, a stripe of black came away, as if the letters were made of ash rather than ink. Alma, I said without deciding to. You still open? The man from the photograph sat behind the desk. I couldn't say how long he'd been there. He wore a short-sleeved shirt with thin vertical stripes the color of old paper. His hat had a sweat stain and a lap around the crown. A cigarette hung burned from his mouth, but there was no smoke. His face was wrong in a way I cannot describe without lying. If I tell you he had no features, you will picture a smoothness that belongs to plaster and mannequins, and he was not that. If I tell you his features were ordinary, you'll imagine a face you've seen in bus stations and DMV lines, and he wasn't that either. His face looked like a word you recognize but can't define when someone asks you to. Folks come in late, he said. His voice had the exact tone of a television in another room you can't quite hear. They're tired, they sign, they sleep, and in the morning, he tapped the page where checked out at dawn repeated like a refrain. You're doing fine, he said. You're going to do just fine. Then he smiled, I think, because the room cooled by a degree and the neon steadied outside as if a breath had been held and released. It's a service we provide. What service is that? I asked, to be unkind to both of us. He looked tired then. Not sorry, tired the way a road gets after miles of tires. He turned the ledger toward me. The first page was the oldest. The paper had foxed at the edges. The names at the top belonged to people who'd learned to drive on different kinds of machines. And there, amid all those records, was the first entry, written in a careful schoolteacher's hand, Alma Hollis. Room 1, checked out at dawn. Beneath the name, lighter than famine, was another line of writing that seemed to have been written from the other side of the paper. Keep the light on. Alma, I said again, because names have power. Because I had none of my own at hand that would help. Are you running it alone, he said? Sure. His hand moved tap, scratch, a duplication of old habits on an empty desk. We keep it open for folks who need a place until morning. After that, the road takes them. He remembered the cigarette, lifted it, inhaled without changing, exhaled nothing. They go where they were going to go, only more so. What about their cars? Their shoes? He blinked. Somewhere in the back room, a door opened on a hinge that had forgotten oil. A shape like a shadow changed its mind, went left instead of right. Rooms come with certain amenities, he said. You can leave something here and know it will be looked after. Like names. It was not a question and didn't matter. I understood at last, not as a thought but as a recognition that settled its weight behind my eyes. The ledger wasn't keeping track of guests. The ledger was the motel. The motel was the ledger. People wrote their names when the night had hollowed them out, and the desert had taken a dry bite of their resolve, and they just needed a place to temporarily be. They signed, and in the morning they were gone, not dead. No, but gone in the way that a hand lets go of a cup and doesn't watch it fall. What happens if someone doesn't check out? I asked. He considered the question. For the first time, I had the sense that there were others in the rooms, not sleeping, but not awake either, lying in positions their bodies had not chosen, and listening to this conversation through carpet and pipe. Why would anyone do that? He asked gently, and I had no answer because I was already imagining breathing here indefinitely, and the imagination is the first check you write without tracking the balance. It's always dawn somewhere, he added, which wasn't helpful or untrue. I need to leave, I said, as politeness dictates when you've stayed too long. Of course, he said. We'll see you tonight. I'm going now. We'll see you, he repeated, and the bell rang once without being touched. Behind me, the door opened to the desert like a mouth. I drove. The highway accepted me briefly the way a drunk accepts water. The world widened and flattened and made its usual promises. I passed a road sign that said Elko 187, and another that said nothing next 50 miles. And then the map inside me became a small, ridiculous thing. I stopped thinking about the motel. I stopped thinking about the ledger. I thought about a childhood corner store clerk who had a tattoo of a swan, and the first time I drove all night by myself and how I'd cried without knowing I was crying at a rest stop south of Flagstaff. Somewhere between one song and the next, I realized the sun was in the wrong place. I don't remember turning off the highway. I remember the way the wheels sounded when gravel replaced asphalt. That gritty escalation like a record's run-out groove. I remember that the sun had taken a slice of the sky so clean it was almost polite. The sign was ahead, the same sign, the neon out-breathing. The moon rose where it had set, and the motel presented its rooms like a hand of cards. I put the car in park and laughed once, a sound I had heard in this place already, and then I went into the office, because shame and curiosity are twins and I was being raised by both. The third night is the one I measure against. Now, when I want to know if something is survivable, all the sounds came and corrected themselves like a chorus finding harmony. Whispering threaded through the air vents. Not malicious, not benevolent, just conversational. The way people talk when they're idling in a parking lot waiting for a show to start. The neon didn't blink this time. It watched and brightened, each pulse accepting and approving. I lay awake and did not move because it felt like movement would reveal me to something that had already counted me. When sleep finally found me, it did not stay long enough to tell me its name. At dawn, 3 suitcases had nested themselves in front of my door, one inside the other like promises keep their own counsel. I pushed past with my shin, and one of them made a noise like an animal you've stepped on that you cannot apologize to. The office smelled stronger of smoke, though no tobacco burned. The man looked up, and if a face could be a shrug, his was. Sometimes folks think they're already traveling, he said mildly. They think this is some interruption they can control. He gestured with his chin toward the ledger. Would you like to initial your page? My page? I asked, but my thumb was already blackening itself again when I touched the name. Something thrummed under the counter, a small machine waking. You don't have to stay in your room, he said. There's a pool. There's no water in it. That's true of a lot of things that still hold you. He waited, as if listening for an announcement. We don't charge for late checkout. That day I walked the perimeter. The desert was indifferent the way the ocean is, not cruel, not kind, vast and busy with its own work. Cactus shouldered the wind. The schoolhouse had a bell that had lost its clapper but still knew what tolling was. A road led to the backbone of hills and then insisted on being no road at all. I could have followed it, could have cut my shoes on it, could have bled my footprints into it, could have kept walking until the sun peeled me. I returned to the motel instead, hot, dusty, absurdly grateful for the rectangle of shade the office cast on the lot. In the afternoon, a family arrived. They came in like a weather cell, loud with relief at finding anything in a place that had nothing. The mother wore a shirt that read, Live, Laugh, Love in uncommitted gray. The father had a beard that was trying to be a plan. The boys were young enough to love each other without understanding it. The oldest pointed at the pool and asked if they could, and the mother said maybe, and the father said, we'll see. I stood on the balcony and watched them discover their rooms like they were boxes in a game show. I considered warning them. Then I watched the oldest boy press his face to the office window, and the bell ring without moving, and the ledger take their names without a hand, and the consideration was taken from me. At dawn there were 4 pairs of shoes in the lot, mismatched, toes arranged toward the office. The car seats held indentations as if bodies had left very recently. The pool reflected the sky perfectly without water to assist it. I opened the office door and the bell rang not with sound but with the memory of sound. The man sat with his knot face composed. They checked out, he said, and the words were not for me exactly. They were for the ledger, which absorbed them and shivered with satisfaction. He turned a page. The paper made a sound like a throat being cleared. Does anyone ever go back, I asked. It came out like a child asking about a pet that has been taken to a fictional farm. His attention complicated for a second. You don't think attention can do that until you see it. Some folks don't get as far, he said. Some take a while longer. Some circle. What's the difference? It's all distance you don't measure with a ruler. He flipped the book shut with a decisive thump that sent dust up in a slow pulse. Do you remember Alma? She opened this place. She wrote her name first. She wrote all of this, he said. And though that wasn't true in any human sense, I knew it was accurate in the one that mattered here. She had made the first incision in the paper, and the paper had been cutting back ever since. That night, the radio returned. The song was all drum and no melody. Footsteps multiplied beyond arithmetic. The neon strobed until there was no difference between off and on. I slept for an hour and dreamed of the office bell ringing at the bottom of a well full of keys. I woke and knew I would not check out. I got up anyway and opened the door to see what being wrong looked like. The parking lot was full. Cars dressed from every decade, all cleared of dust as if nightly polished by a damp and careful cloth. Their hoods were cool. Their mirrors held only the desert and my face, which had learned nothing. The man was waiting with the ledger open to my page. He didn't touch the pen that wasn't there. He said my whole name, and it sounded like a prayer, the way prayers do when you're old enough that a prayer is just a plain sentence. It's dawn, he said. It's night. He considered that and then nodded as if allowing an argument he'd heard 100 times that had never satisfied him. It's the dawn that counts, he said. Not the light. The hour. The bell agreed, a single pulse of not quite noise. I looked down. In the checked out column there was a smear that had not been there before, as if someone had pressed their thumb on the ink of my future and dragged it slightly to the right. Alma? I asked again, and this time the ledger answered. Not in words, but by shivering under my hands like an animal that wants to get free but likes being held because the holding proves it exists. What did she want? I asked the man as if he could hear the past any better than I could. Why did she start this? She wanted a place to catch people, he said simply. Sometimes the world forgets you in the middle of the road. Sometimes the road forgets you in the middle of the world. She made a place of remembering. It was a mercy. And the trap? He met my eyes, or rather I met where his eyes must have been. Mercy is always a trap, he said gently. That's how it works. I checked out at dawn. The road was there, and then it was not there, and then it was again. I passed a truck whose driver was singing, and another whose cab was empty, and a third that carried a horse that lifted its head and looked at me with a knowledge that bothered me for miles. I saw a town, and then the town was ash. I ate a sandwich in a place with a name, and then I didn't. Time coned out behind me without leaving a line. The world kept being true whether I believed it or not. At a gas station that may have been the same one I had already visited twice, a woman at the register said, "You look like you just checked in," and I said, "Checked out," and she said, "Sure." "Already did," I said, and that was true in completely the wrong tense, and she nodded as if I had confessed something she had been trained to absolve. When I got back in my car, there was dust on the passenger seat in the shape of a small bag. I brushed it away and my hand went black with it, and I started the engine, and the radio required no station to give me the drum again. The thing about loops is that you never notice the curve while you're walking it. You look up one day and recognize the starter gun and the lane lines and the bleachers, and you say, "Oh." You say, "Oh, I've been here before and I've been here before." And then you check the clock and see that it's dawn, and what you thought was a horizon is a finish line that doesn't care if you cross it or memorize it or lie down on it like a bed. I drove until my hands stopped learning from the wheel, and my neck forgot to carry my head, and the sun slid down the sky like a coin into a slot that has taken the last of your change. You want me to say I broke it? You want me to say I tore the page out? Or I wrote someone else's name? Or I lit a match and fed the book to a clean, honest fire that took everything I gave it and left only the relief of ashes and the sweet charcoal taste of freedom? I wanted to say those things too. I wanted to be the kind of person for whom that story is true. The kind of person who stands up and does what has to be done in the middle of a room full of objects that belong to other people who no longer need them. I wanted a hero whose outline would fit me if I stood in the right light and spread my arms. I checked out at dawn again and again. I am writing this from the room that was mine and is mine. Whenever I sit on the bed and put my feet on the carpet and listen for the radio, the neon is steady tonight. The wind is considerate. The desert is making itself enormous with its usual competence. In the office, the man nods to the book and the book pages itself open. Across the pool, which reflects the past instead of the sky, A suitcase snaps its mouth for no reason except sound wants to exist. Cars line up in the lot the way sentences line up on a page when someone knows exactly what they mean to say. Somewhere a bell has forgotten it ever made a sound and remembers it anyway. If you find yourself low on gas and lower on options and the evening turns numinous the way it turns in deserts and old churches and hospital corridors, you may see the sign before you want to. It will say vacancy and mean relief the way a pond means shade in July. The office will be empty and not empty. The bell will remember how to make a sound and make the memory of it. The ledger will be open. The names will be gouged in like railroads. You will stand there and think that to write your name is to confess you exist. You will think that writing your name is how you leave a mark, and you will be correct. You will write, and dawn will accept your correction. Ash Springs has vacancies. We are open since '63. We will always be open at dawn. The desert around Goldfield, Nevada is a white glare at noon, and a brittle hush under the stars. And on the day Elijah Kane found the lockbox, both versions of that emptiness seemed to be watching. He had followed a rumor out past the last porch light, past the railroad berm where empty cans still rusted in neat rows, and let his powder blue pickup idle at the edge of a dry wash. The hood trembled in the heat. A coil of rope rattled in the bed beside a shovel, a pry bar and a metal detector whose stem was taped where it had cracked. The outskirts of Goldfield are not a place for hope so much as for excuses, and Elijah was full of the kind a man makes when the rent is due and the luck is late. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence threw the world into high relief. The grit ticking against his fenders, the rasp of a grasshopper, a far sound like metal tapping metal that seemed too regular to belong to wind. He told himself it was the flap of a loose license plate, then ran a thumb over the plate and felt the screws tight. He told himself it was his own keys, then stood still until they settled and the tapping went on without them. The town lay behind him in a low mirage of head frames and false fronts, a boom town that had burst and shrank like a lung until it forgot how to breathe. He took a swallow of warm water, slung the detector, and stepped into the wash where the dust kept the memory of older feet. He parked at the lip of a shallow arroyo where the yucca grew mean and the soil changed tone like a bruise. The wind carried the clink of some far-off chain, or maybe his own keys, and a faint rhythm of metal tapping metal too regular to be natural and too stubborn to be an echo. The town lay behind him, a scatter of graves and half-rebuilt facades, the gold camp that burst and shrank like a lung until it forgot how to breathe. He told himself he couldn't hear anything, then admitted he could, then decided the desert had learned to throw old noises funny, and would keep doing so until he left. The signal came not like a siren, but like a heartbeat, a steady blip beneath the wash, under a crust of stones that had baked into each other. He flushed dirt from the base of a mesquite whose roots had gone crooked in their thirst, and the blade hit iron with a clack that shot up his arms. He widened the hole and found a box no bigger than a loaf of bread, the hinges melted with rust, the lid scabbed with desert in a way that made it look like it had been trying to become stone. He lifted it out, and the rhythm in his ears stopped so suddenly he nearly lost his balance in the quiet it left. The lock had surrendered decades ago. The hasp opened with a sigh. Inside was not gold, not coins, not the neat promise of a man who had planned for his own future. There were small bones strung with twine and stained in greasy crescents where old fingers had held them. There were 3 teeth that were human and 2 that by size must have belonged to a mule. There was a brass thimble bent into a heart and a pair of children's buttons threaded together with rusty wire. And there was a ledger, the cheap kind with a limp cardboard cover and blue lines marching to margins darkened by the oils of long-vanished hands. The first page laid itself open without being asked, as if turning had been its nature all along. Elijah sat back on his heels. The heat seemed to press down as if the sky were a hand. He turned the pages. Names filled them in columns, not all in the same hand. Some entries had long tails of comment. $16 for ore car borrowed. Tally for whiskey. Pay to O'Brien for broken finger in fight. Nails 12. Use of burro. Week. And between the mundane debts, cheap saloon arithmetic, were other lines whose words elbowed all the air from his lungs. For my wife's pain. For the night at Tunnel Mouth. For burying my boy. For the silence took by force. Beside those lines, stamped hard and over, was a word like a brand. Paid. The ink looked like it had been mixed from lampblack and old water. Prints of thumbs stained the corners like a choir of wrong witnesses. He kept turning pages and found the last one incomplete. A few names trailed off mid-stroke as if someone had tried to write while standing up from a chair. Below them, a square of text had been written as a kind of oath, and above it, crooked as a blister, a thumbprint. I, Amos J. Rideout of the District and County of Esmeralda, being sound of mind and fevered with rage, do hereby pledge that every man who took from me under color of law, or the shadow of darkness, shall be repaid in measure of bone for coin, of breath for breath, of blood for whiskey, until the book balances. If the living will not pay, the ground will. The signature dragged as if the pen had been pulled through a syrup of grief. The date was winter. A month that must have been hard. Elijah read it twice. He told himself that curses were stories told to keep men hungry and honest, and he had never been one for superstition. Then he found, tucked at the back cover as if someone had wanted to fold the world into the book and had used the last available pocket, a square of cloth. It was stiff with dried brown and cut from something sturdy like work trousers. A small bone lay stitched into one corner, the stitching meticulous, the thread waxed dark. The bone was carved with the same mark as the thumbprint, a whorl that suggested the eye of a man who saw more after he died than before. He put the bones back gently, slid the ledger under his shirt, and stood with the box under his arm. The heat dropped then in a way the desert does not permit at noon. A shadow passed with no bird to cast it. The air smelled briefly of damp timber and the iron taste of old blood. Something far off struck rock with a rhythm not of wind or goat hooves, the old music of picks in a shaft. He told himself this was his own heart drum in his ear, told himself he would sell the ledger or at least photograph it and set the photographs in a folder named with dignity. He told himself many things and believed none of them. By late afternoon, the mirages had grown lanes and institutions, towns of water where each shimmer was a window to a better life. Elijah checked into a room big enough for a bed and small enough for his thoughts. The clerk was a woman with straw hair and a tattoo of a horseshoe on her wrist. She kept glancing at the box, and once her eyes flinched to the ledger, and then away as if something had touched the back of her own throat. "You finding junk in the dirt?" she asked. "Just old junk," Elijah said. To say otherwise was to give the story air. He took a shower long enough to feel his skin again and then laid the ledger on the bedspread. He could have photographed each page under the lamp and been done, but he found himself reading aloud, name after name: Miles Kane, Destry Holt, Thomas Quinn. He spoke them softly until the sounds lost edges and became shapes his throat wore. Outside, the neon from the motel court lit his curtain with a pulse-like breath. He had never felt lonely like a choice before. Tonight it felt chosen for him. At dusk he walked across the lot to the diner, and the waitress called him honey without looking at him and set down water whose ice had already given up. A man at the counter had the look of a shovel in a suit. Long and tired, built for work he did not care for. He lifted his coffee and said without turning, "You digging out there?" "Some," Elijah said. "Hear anything?" "Coyotes," Elijah said. But the man shook his head once, and the movement drew a silence from the other booths like fabric gathering. "Coyotes don't swing a pick," the man said. He turned then and showed a name tag that read IRA. "They've been at it a long time. Not that you should worry. They ain't after you unless you sign your name." Elijah laughed because he needed his mouth to do something. "You think I dug up a ghost?" Ira shrugged. "I think the ground's a book and men are always dog-earing the worst part so they can find it again." Elijah ate his meatloaf and found it turned to paste when it met his tongue. He walked back under the strained light and told himself he would sleep and drive the ledger to Tonopah in the morning to show the museum. He told himself he would not go back to the arroyo in the night, would not be the kind of man who gives the dark an advantage. At 3 a.m, he woke to the sound of coins settling. The room was dark but not dark. The sign's glow sought a thin illumination through the curtains. The coins, if that was what he heard, fell with the viscosity of someone dropping them through a bag of flour. He sat up and the mattress made that old sigh that old mattresses make when they have learned men's weights and gotten sick of them. The sound did not stop. He fumbled for the lamp, and when the bulb warmed, he saw that the lockbox had slid from the chair to the floor and lay open without the act of opening. The coins were not coins at all. They were small pebbles that had arranged themselves in stacks like the piles miners make at the mouth of a tunnel. Each stack a bland monument to work. The ledger lay open by itself to a page he did not remember leaving it on. The name at the top of the page was E. Stafford, and beside it the note, "For failing to bring the rope up when Shaughnessy called." The word "paid" waited next to it, patient as a noose. Elijah closed the book, then opened it. The page was different. Now the name read C. Dillard, and beside it, "For the bottle that sent my brother's hands to sleep." Paid. He licked his lips and tasted iron. He flipped a handful of pages, and the names moved under his fingertips like fish. He snapped the book shut and set his palm on the cover and felt a faint flutter, as if there were a moth inside and it was almost ready to be a moth again. He would take it back, he decided. In daylight, men make reasonable decisions. He placed the ledger inside the box and wrapped them in an old t-shirt, and when he carried them out, the morning felt brittle as unglazed porcelain. The parking lot had been swept in the night by a wind that left false trails of dust like pale arms pointing toward the highway. He put the box on the passenger seat again and thought of buckling it. He did not. The keys felt like gravel in his hand. The truck started. He drove toward the wash. He had to stop once because the sound of picks grew so loud inside the cab that he thought something had gotten into the wheel well. He knelt on the shoulder and looked. There was nothing but the light-rattled shimmer of heat and the thin outline of the town's distant headframes like rib bones against the sky. He got back in and drove on. When he turned off the crude track, onto the stony wash, the sun made a hard white of everything and smeared every edge until he felt he was driving into a white page. He parked where he had parked and set his boots where his boots had been. No animal had crossed. The air was clean of news. But when he stood, he saw a line of footprints leading a way that he had not made. They were not coyotes or men. They were bare. The toes splayed as if whatever owned them had never learned shoes. They led across the wash toward the remains of a claim fence, where a line of wire glinted like a mouth. He told himself that footprints in the desert often began before you made. Then, because the wind rehearsed them in the sand for the convenience of the story, he told himself that what he was seeing was nothing but a trick of light. Then he followed them because men follow lines the way water does. They led to a spot where the ground had the texture of a scab. When he looked closely, he saw that the soil was bored with small holes in a perfect circle, as if a careful man had driven nails there and removed them. The wind flickered. The rhythm of the picks began again, but now it wasn't underneath him. It was around him, as if a ring of men unseen labored at the edge of hearing. Elijah crouched. The circle of holes was the diameter of a head. He put his palm to the center. The dirt was cool. His fingers came back with a smell like the inside of a damp glove. He walked backward. He wanted to leave but could not show his back. The sun had found a way to be colder. He tripped on something and looked down to see a length of rope half buried like a snake. He tugged it free. It was stiff but not brittle. At its end was a knot that looked like a fist pressing its own knuckles to silence. He dropped it, and the knot thumped the ground with a weight that made a puff of dust. Behind him, no sound. Then a breath. He turned. No one. The air smelled like sweat evaporated from wood. Goldfield's main street is a collage of stubborn buildings. The courthouse has more dignity than the town deserves. A gift shop sells rocks that the hills gave up reluctantly, and beer that the patrons relinquish with ease. Elijah parked and carried the ledger to the museum, like a patient carrying his own film from the radiology clinic. The woman at the desk wore a name tag that read, Beryl. She had a way of halting her smile in mid-approach as if she had learned that objects bite. "May I help you?" "I found something in the wash," he said, and laid the ledger where she could see the care with which his hand did not tremble. He told her near enough to the truth. She asked if she could show the director, and he shrugged and folded his arms and watched her carry a century of rage into a back office as if she carried a pie. The weight made him smaller. He heard a radio somewhere play a song about roads. He counted floor tiles and then miscounted them and felt that the miscount mattered. When Beryl returned, she had a man with her whose face had the good manners to be skeptical. "Tom," she said. "This is Mr. E." "Elijah," he said. "I like the old things that want to be found," Tom said, and shook his hand as if the gesture might disarm a trap. He opened the ledger and ran his finger along the entries the way a priest might read a list of the forgiven. "We can't authenticate in a day," Tom said. "But this..." He touched the page the way a man touches a bit of firewood to test if it is still warm. "This has something. If you're willing to leave it with us, we can..." Before he could say catalog, the lights went out. It was full day, but the room became a shade darker than it had any right to be. The radio cut to silence that seemed too strict. They waited. The overhead fluorescence stuttered back, then not. In that short dark, Elijah heard a clink. When the lights returned, a nail lay on the ledger, square-cut, the kind that old miners used in their head frames. It had not been there. Beryl did not touch it. Tom did not pretend it was normal. Elijah took the nail and put it in his pocket because some things only become more real when left behind. Elijah went out with the ledger under his shirt again. Men on the sidewalk pretended not to look at his hands. He hated them for their pretenses and loved them for it too. He went to his truck, then paused, then opened the box of maps he kept behind the seat and slid the ledger under them because paper seemed like the only thing that could protect paper. He started the engine. The sound of picks came with it. He drove out of town. The sky had clouded from nothing to a lace of high cirrus that the sun wore like a veil, and the heat became speculative, as if it had to ask permission to move. Back at the arroyo, he found that the hole he had filled had been reopened, neat as a careful vandal, the dirt packed into little loaves beside it. The box sat where he had placed it, the t-shirt now stained dark as if it had sucked mist from nowhere. He lifted the ledger from the maps. He meant to put it back, to slam the lid, to heap the dirt and drive away. When he unwrapped it, he found the last page filled with a new hand. The hand was his. He recognized the long, cautious loops of his E and the fussy stubbornness of his J. The entry was simple. E. Kane for waking the book. Beside it, the column for payment blank. "I'm sorry," he said to the ground, and he meant it. "I didn't mean..." His mouth ran out of verbs. He held the ledger up as if to show his apology to the page. The wind changed. It came from underground. He felt it in his ankles first, a cool mint of air that tasted like an old mine. The odor carried oil and rot, and a sweetness he did not want identified. He heard the old rhythm close now. The tap, tap, tapping, chips of stone flicked into a leather palm. He wanted to lay the book down and run. The circle of nail holes waited the way a mouth waits for a spoon. Elijah did not scream. He wanted to save his voice. He laid the ledger down gently, like a baby he had no right to hold. The nail shadows bowed and straightened once as if acknowledging the gesture. Then the ground where he had seen the rope collapsed and the rope revealed itself as a loop that had been waiting. It tightened around his ankle faster than a thought. He fell with a grunt that tasted like shame. He reached for the loop. It burned and cut. He grabbed for the shovel, and the shovel was suddenly too heavy with the hands of men who were not there. They pulled him toward the circle. The small holes smoked a little as if exhaling their patience. He swung the shovel and felt it hit something, soft and surprisingly wet, but there was nothing to see the hit. The rope answered by tightening in pulses that matched the rhythm of picks. He gritted and dug the shovel blade into the dirt like an oar. It got him a foot, then 6 inches. He heard his knees tearing in their old ways and thought of soccer and youth and choices that had seemed like altitude and were only gravity. The rope stopped. The ledger lay open to the oath. Elijah put his hand on the ledger. The page with his name throbbed beneath his palm as if it were a throat. He understood then that he was not to be killed, because he had been bad, but because he had been adjacent. He had brought his living breath to a place where the dead were still paying. He tried to think of a gesture that was bigger than sorry, and found only this. He tore the page with his name from the ledger and put it in his mouth and chewed. Paper stuck to his teeth. The taste was dust and the faint ghost of sugar. He swallowed. The rope slackened as if surprised. He would have failed if not for the ant. It walked across the page, red and leggy, an impossible bright thing in all that beige. He watched it detour around the wet thumbprint oath and hurry between the words, breath for breath, as if knowing where it went. He put the tip of his finger in its path so that it crawled on his skin, and while it did, he felt a memory that was not his. A boy in a tent in the yard of a boarding house, lantern shadows thrown big. A man telling him that miners come home with the mind still in them, and that if they do not lay it gently down, it will keep them. The memory broke like a bubble. The ant went on. He stood, and the rope fell away with no hand to loose it. The ropes opened like eyes. He scrambled away on his elbows until his hands found the shovel, and the shovel found the rope, and the rope stayed cut when he hacked it. He stood with one foot a man and the other still an animal in a trap. He cut again. The loop slipped. He fell backward. He expected hands. None came. The circle filled itself like a lung learning to be a lung. The nail shadows sank as if called to supper. The wind went back to being nothing again. He lay there and shook. The ledger lay in the dust like a thing asleep after a tantrum. He drove as if the road had become a long nail he was sliding along. He reached the motel and told himself he would check out but could not remember the act of paying or the figure of the clerk. The room smelled of air that had been argued over. He sat on the bed and thought of the men whose names had ended in paid and of the many whose did not. He thought of the rope's logic. He slept and dreamt that the desert had a ledger under its skin, an acreage of paper that ran from Tonopah to Beatty, and every name on it made a sound like a card in bicycle spokes. The ledger stood on the dresser open to a page that had not existed, a new column of names that he did not know, with dates next to them that were tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after. At the top, in a hand he recognized as the ledger's first, patient, almost kind, was written, "Accounts accepted by witness become his to settle." In the margin, a nailhead at every line like a blessing or a threat. Elijah closed the book then the way a man closes a dead friend's eyes. He carried it out to the truck and drove to the diner. He went to the diner and found Ira, as if the man had been manufactured to sit on that stool and say what a stranger deserved. He dropped the ledger on the counter. The coffee rattled in cups. The waitress made a sound and backed away so that the sugar packets between them might protect her. Elijah opened the book to the new page. "These people," he said, "they're not dead yet. I don't know them. I don't want them." Ira looked once and put his hand flat over the page and then lifted it away quickly as if heat had risen. "That's a book that teaches a man he's a town," he said. "Some of those you can pay. Some you can't. If you don't try, it'll pay itself with what you are." Elijah left the diner with a list. He made calls. He knocked on doors. He found a Cindy Dillard in Pahrump, and a Eugene Stafford in Henderson, and a Thomas Quinn 2 counties over, who had never been to Goldfield, but whose grandfather had. He brought groceries and paid overdue fines and returned tools he hadn't borrowed, and apologized to people he had never offended. The book changed grudgingly, like a man healing who will not stop touching his wound. Paid appeared where he could put a thing in a hand. Where he could not, it stayed blank in a way that seemed heavier than ink. But it was not all possible. There remained the names with notes like, "For the cry that would not stop." What is the currency for that? He dreamed answers and woke to their uselessness. He went back to the arroyo because sometimes men go back to a crime scene not to gloat but to confess. The circle of nail holes had closed as if it had never been. The mesquite wore the same accidental symmetry. He stood and said aloud, "I cannot pay for what I did not take, but I will stand here when the count is made." The desert took the sentence into itself and made no change in its face. He drove to the museum. Beryl was not at the desk. The lights were on and then were less on, a dimming that felt like someone had put a cloth over the sun. He called her name and his voice occupied the room like a bad smell. He found her in the back office, sitting very straight with her hands on the desk. On the desk before her lay an old coil of wire like the kind once strung between a head frame and a winch. "It was on my chair," she said, and her voice was the exact tone of someone who has decided to finish a difficult day before starting to cry. It wasn't here and then it was. Elijah did not touch the wire. He did not have to. It recognized the ledger and lay very still. He became peculiar. People gave him looks the way they give warnings to dogs with eyes too white. He wore the coil of wire over his shoulder like a bandolier. He kept the ledger in a bag close to his ribs. He learned to listen not for the picks but for the breath before the pick. He could tell when the ledger wanted him to turn a page the way a mother can tell when a baby is about to cry. He was in the motel room reading a list of names that had never been born when he heard the first knock. It was not at the door. It was under the bed. Something thick struck the box spring twice and then settled into the slow, patient rhythm of work. One by one, as the weeks folded in on themselves, the men in the book came for him not as apparitions, but as tasks. He found a man named Holt, whose granddaughter worked the truck stop on the highway and gave her the thimbled heart, and her face changed shape as if the inside of her had been rearranged to fit a missing thing. He found a Quinn whose tendency was to break his own hand on walls, and taught him instead to hammer loose boards until the desire ran out of him like rain from a boot. He found a Destry who had owed $32 for powder, and paid it to a charity with the quiet terror of a man buying his way out of a dream. Each time the ledger waited and then reluctantly stamped paid. Each time the sound of picks that night was fainter than not. All along he avoided the final column where his own name waited for its settlement. He ate paper and he hauled wire, and he slept in a world that smelled of old lumber and cold coins, but he did not put paid next to himself. He could not find the currency. He thought it might be the easiest thing. A sorry said deep enough to reach men lying in old stopes, a promise not to dig. But every night when the picks came, when the shaft wind lifted the hair on his forearms, he knew that what was owed was not words but hours and hands, and the small suffering that makes a day honest. On the evening the storm came, he drove out for air he could not afford. Thunder over the Esmeralda Range is a parlor trick usually, sound without water. But this time the black rolled with weight. The heat had a rind. He parked by the arroyo because it was a place with an address to his fear. He sat on the hood of the truck and felt the metal soak him. Lightning stitched the sky with a pursemaker's care. The first drop slapped the dust and made that smell of forgiveness. He thought of Amos Rideout in The Oath and the way his thumbprint looked like the mouth of a tunnel. "Take it," he said to the air that had been holding its breath since before he was born. "I'll pay." The rain agreed by increasing. The arroyo began to speak in runnels. The picks started up underneath and then around and then above him. The music of a town rebuilt out of nothing but the desire to work. He climbed down. He went to the circle that was not there until you wanted it. It waited. He lay on it like a man in a chalk outline. The cool came up through his shirt. The ground stated its terms, breath for breath, bone for coin, hour for hour. He counted what he had and found that the only riches in him were time and pain, and the willingness to spend both. He worked with them. He stood in the wash when the water rose and held the coil of wire so the current could find a path. He dragged fallen mesquite from the channel with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with arithmetic. He carried rocks until his fingers forgot how to be human. He spoke to the ledger under the rain, and the rain made the ink bloom in places and vanish in others, and still the book recorded what the ground would not forget. When lightning struck the railroad berm, it sounded like the shout of a foreman in a shaft where no shaft had been, and the cool rose with a voice. The first time we saw the church, it didn't look like a church at all. More like a listing barn dropped onto the ribs of the Nevada desert and left to splinter. Someone had nailed a crooked cross over the door, and the doors themselves were gray slabs flayed by weather, one broken from its hinges and leaning like a knocked-out tooth. There was no bell tower. There was no bell. Only rafters collapsed like a ribcage caved in by a giant's boot, and a square frame of sky beyond, bleached to a color that made my eyes ache. We were four that afternoon. Eli with his camera bag, Nina with a coil of climbing rope we never used, Jordan in the faded band tee he wore like armor, and me, making sure the cooler of waters and the tire patch kids stayed in the back of the truck. The ghost town didn't have a name on any map we could find. It drifted out of the sage like a dead thing half buried by sand. 10 shacks. A boarded store with its porch collapsed, and at the center, as if someone had planned a town with a soul, the wooden church with no bell. We had followed a string of mining camps that summer on weekends, sleeping rough or at cheap motels, tracing rumors posted on forums where usernames were as disposable as empty gas station cups. The map on my lap had rings of pencil around old claims. The notes in the margins were a palimpsest of collapsed shaft. Watch for rattlers and caretaker may still shoot. We never carried more than a pocket knife and a mother's lecture against trespassing. The thrill was the same as walking dead hallways after school. The place had a story, and you wanted to be the one to touch its last remaining sentence. Ghost towns are quiet, but the quiet changes town to town. Some are busy with flies and the wind's scolding. Some are hollowed to a silence that feels packed with chalk-dry breath, like someone just hushed a classroom. Eli was first through the doorway. He lifts his camera to anything with edges, but he slows when he steps on church floors. He says wood like this holds the weight of words once spoken in its presence, and you can hear them if you listen, not with your ears, but with the soles of your feet. "Careful," he said, because a joist had yawed open and I could see down into the darkness of the crawl space where pack rats had hauled a collapsed hymn book, its pages stuck into a mound of sticks like white leaves after a storm. Nina guided me around by the elbow. "I don't like the roof," she said. "I don't like the way the light comes through it, like it's ignoring something." Jordan laughed under his breath and said, "It's a church, not a sunroof," but he kept his hands in his pockets as if contact might burn him. There were pews, or the suggestion of them, wrenched askew by buckled planks and the shifting of the earth. One whole side door had fallen inward and was being eaten where it lay by a tumble of mouse nests. Over the altar, someone had painted a pale square the size of a window, but there was no glass. A frame remained, its mitered corners too neat for the rest of the ruin. And within the frame a panel of wood, lighter than the surrounding boards, nailed over something. The nail heads were dark domes like eyes. Nina stepped up and touched it with the back of her hand. "Cold," she said. It was the hottest part of the day. When she pulled her hand back, there were 4 pale ovals on the wood and breath fogging her lips though the air was an oven. We laughed then too, the way you laugh when you realize you're telling yourself a ghost story before dusk. The laughter didn't take. It clattered and fell somewhere in the rafters and didn't come back. We pitched camp on the far side of the town where an arroyo made a dry crease. There was a hint of old water, silt hard as pottery, and a fringe of rabbit brush clinging as if it remembered what thirst meant. Eli shot until the light went nuclear and all the colors flattened. Nina uncoiled her rope and walked the perimeter of the church once, twice, as if she could measure bad luck and tie a knot in it. Jordan popped the cooler and found a soda gone almost hot and said it tasted like childhood. I recorded the long, flat breathing of the desert on my phone and tried to make my voice funny while I narrated. Our fines for the handful of subscribers who liked to watch us go places they wouldn't. When the sun ripped itself down the horizon, the air cooled with a panic, the way heat leaves a hospital corridor when visiting hours end. We stayed awake because the stars made a dome you could feel with your shoulders, and because of the coyotes, which tuned their yips to the rocks. The church was a black wedge against the sky, its frame of window like a missing tooth in a skull. The town had no electricity. Our truck battery clicked once when Eli checked the time in the cab, and then decided it had given enough. "We should turn in," Nina said, but she kept seated, arms wrapped around her knees as if bracing against a wave. Somewhere past midnight, the wind dropped and there was a pressure in the air that reminded me of the pause before an orchestra begins. Every instrument lifted, every breath held, the conductor's baton a white bone against velvet. I didn't realize I had stood until I was already standing. Eli's camera, set on its tripod, pointed at the church like an accusation. Jordan was looking at the stars as if searching for a sign he didn't believe in. Nina said, "Do you hear?" The first toll came like metal waking. It was clear and it was far. Not the cowbell clunk you get on a ranch, not the thin ding of a doorbell in a farmhouse. It was the kind of bell you feel in your chest, the kind that lives inside towers in towns with names you say like a prayer. It came from the church, our church, the church with no bell. One, then a patient breath, then another. Not hurried, not frantic, exact as a heartbeat measured by a hand on a wrist. 12 times if I counted right, or maybe 12 and a breath, or maybe the counting was beside the point. The sound laid itself over the bones of the town, and our bones too. The coyotes stopped. Even insects seemed to forget themselves. My mouth watered like I was standing in the doorway of a bakery, and my grandmother was about to name each pastry by the shape of its glaze. When the tolling stopped, the silence thinned as if someone had cut into it. The prayers came soft enough to be mistaken for leaves. We didn't move for a while because the first language you learn in places like that is stillness. The words did not belong to any tongue I knew. Later, we would try to map them to sound families we half remembered from documentaries. A hint of Slavic, a rust of Greek, a scrape of Latin. Sometimes it sounded like something older, like what your throat does when you cough blood. The rhythm of it was the rhythm of liturgy. The cadence fell and rose, and each rise pulled a piece of me off its nail. Radio? Jordan whispered, because questions are offerings in the dark. Eli shook his head, hand on the camera as if it were a child that might wake. Nina leaned forward so far she put her palm on the dirt between her boots and said nothing at all. In the morning, the church was only wood again. Only nails and a geometry of loss. But you don't walk back the same path after you hear a sound like that. We moved like the ground was hinged. Eli tugged the video from his camera and watched the clip frame by frame while we drank the dust-flavored coffee we made by boiling bottled water over the stove. The stars lifted as if on a pulley. The church darkened. Then, at a time you could set a clock by, Eli's audio spiked and the waveform grew teeth. We watched the frames that showed the doorway. At the third toll, something passed in the narrow rectangle of black. A shift, the suggestion of fabric in a windless night. It could be bats, Jordan said, hopeful as a boy, then deflated when no bats came back and the shape didn't repeat. On the soundtrack, the prayers were there, low enough to make our speakers tremble. He scrubbed backward and forward until he nearly erased the space between the tolls with his impatience. There, Nina said. She tapped the screen at a glitch where a line of pixels at the top jittered in a thin wave. On the second pass, I saw that the wave repeated on the fourth toll, on the sixth, on the eighth, not on the first, not on the third. Even numbers, she said. Eli nodded as if he too liked numbers that behaved. Like breath, he said. In on one, hold on two, out on three. Not like breath, Nina said, and looked at the painted square above the altar as if expecting an answer. We went inside. Eli shot stills. Jordan picked up a piece of the hymn book and tried to read a page that no longer remembered it was a page. Nina went to the painted square. Up close you could see that the panel that had felt cold was held not by new nails, but by the heads of old nails rubbed clean. The space around them had been polished by touch, though nothing else here had been cared for. She pressed her ear against the wood. We held our breath without being told. Nothing, she said, and because saying a thing makes it safe, we all breathed again. But she didn't move her head away. There is nothing, she said again, and the way she said it made the words feel like a piece of furniture we had to make room for. There were carvings on the inner walls, where the paint had blistered. Not names or hymns, not pentagrams or the teenager's sickle of a heart, lines that interrupted each other with a neat precision. A simple braid of 3 strokes repeated and reversed as if the hand that cut them had been told to practice a single shape until it could make it in the dark. Eli photographed them, and later I would find them again, cropped and printed in his notebook like stamp edges, then again in the smudge on our truck's dusty hood, where someone had traced them with one finger when we weren't looking. We told one another stories of how such noises might be made. There could be a bell buried somewhere, and when the ground contracted with the night, it might clink against a rock. Sound moves in weird ways, or a nighttime wind could make a loose sheet of tin against a stovepipe boom like a drum. We climbed each shack and store and found nothing that wanted to be a bell. Afternoon brought a squint of clouds no one believed in. The heat fell on us like a moth-eaten blanket. We should leave after dark, Jordan said. We've filmed enough. We can make it to Tonopah by dawn. No one disagreed, which is not the same as agreeing. We kept finding reasons to stay 10 minutes more. Then 10. Then Nina said, if we stay, we lock the truck. We stay together. We do not go inside. We nodded like kids reciting rules at a pool. The second night, the wind quit early. You could hear the unstitching of it in the grass. Coyotes didn't bother singing. We set our camp chairs in a row facing the church like a family at the world's dullest parade. Eli put fresh batteries in the camera, as if that would matter to the dead. Jordan fiddled with his phone until the battery icon became a scold. Nina tied her rope into a circle and set it around our feet. She said old miners used to use circles to keep snakes from crossing their beds. Chalk for scorpions, salt for ghosts. Which is this for, I asked. We'll see, she said, and smiled a tired dentist's smile that asks a mouth to forgive the pain it is about to cause. At midnight, the first toll arrived without preface. It didn't gather. It simply was, like weather you wake up inside of. You could feel it ring the air. We counted together, whispering numbers like a childish charm, and made it to 12 with the relief of survivors. The prayers came in a spill. This time, even Jordan didn't try to map them to a radio station. They came from the church. That's the easy way to say it, but in the moment, the sound came from the lines of us from the circle Nina had made, from the earth under our chairs. I felt them through the bones of the jaw. I heard the friction of syllables I could not form. a rough music that made the body want to kneel. "We are not going inside," Nina said. And whether she knew it or not, she said it in time, her voice falling into the seam between two measure-long phrases. And when she did, the prayers stumbled. Not for long, just a hiccup, but long enough to let us imagine a choice. "Do you think they mean something?" Eli asked. "Of course they mean something," Jordan said, as if the idea that anything might be meaningless could save him. Eli blinked in the dark like a slow shudder. "No, I mean, do you think they're for us?" The tone of the prayers changed at the word, and it was a music change only in the sense that a thunderhead is a change from blue sky. Suddenly the words were present tense. Suddenly the prayers knew our names though they never said them. Every childhood scolding, every bedside whisper, every moment you were told to listen and be good, lived inside that sound. It was not pleading. It was not praise. It was the sound a fence makes, here and no farther. "We are not going inside," Nina said again, and the circle at our feet felt taut as a tied artery. I was the first to stand. I told myself it was to stretch a cramp out of my leg, but it was to bring my ears closer to the source the way you lean in when someone tells you a secret. I walked to the edge of the circle. The air beyond it was not colder. It was emptier, like a room after everyone has left and the dust hasn't settled yet. "Don't," Nina said. "There's a kind of don't that draws a silhouette around the shape of dew." Jordan put his hands under his thighs and sat on them like a child who can't be trusted not to touch a cake. Eli lifted the camera and found me in the frame. "Just close-ups," I said. "Just detail for the edit." I stepped out. The prayers sharpened as if notorious for cutting. The cadence worked on my breathing until it found the part of me that believed I had always been meant to breathe that way. I stopped at the threshold because thresholds are stories. There are rules at thresholds even if you don't know them. Knock, speak, offer, don't look back. The door hung open like a broken jaw. Inside, the church was a cave someone had built in the shape of a room. My eyes adjusted slow as sap. I could make out the outline of the pews, the narrow spine of the aisle, the altar at the far end with its pale square above it. The panel looked like nothing in particular, and also the most important thing. Eli's camera whirred behind me as it hunted focus. Nina said my name like a lasso. Jordan said, "Don't, man, please." The prayers weren't louder inside. They were clearer, as if each word had been wiped with a cloth. In the clarity, I found an image. Not meaning, not a translation, but a picture of a hand held palm out. And beyond the fingers, a slope of scree under a bruised sky. The feeling that came with it was the feeling of cresting a hill and seeing a fire you didn't start eating a settlement of wagons. That cannot be the right picture, I told myself. It's too old, it belongs to other bones. But the prayers did not belong to any set of owners. They were common property in the way of warning shouted down a line. "Out," Nina said. The words were loud enough to have edges. I turned. She was in the doorway's light rope circle empty behind her, arms stiff at her sides as if holding something heavy and invisible. A promise, maybe. "We have what we came for," she said. "We will leave." The prayers shifted again. If you've ever listened to a person far away speaking and you don't know what they're saying, but you know when their voice turns to ask a question, it was like that. Something in the sound waited for us to answer. Because we didn't, it answered for us. The air changed pressure. I heard a clack under the floor like teeth touching. Then something in the painted square above the altar cooled the room by a breath. The panel did not move. The nails did not tremble. But it was as if the wood behind the wood leaned closer to the room. You'll forgive me if I say that I walked forward because my feet did. It's the oldest dodge in any story about compulsion. The way men confess to not knowing why they kissed or crossed. But the truth is less dramatic. My body thought silence meant safety, and that sound meant the opposite. And the only way to get back to silence was to go toward the sound and end it where it started. The aisle floor groaned, and the pack rats scuttled under the cracks with their store of pages. I reached the altar rail, what remained of it, and put my fingers on the topmost slab of wood as if I might jump it. The prayer swelled a fraction, then held like gas before a match. I was close enough to see that the pale square had hairline cracks in it like veins in marble. Not in the panel itself, but in something beneath it. And the panel showed those veins as if paper held to a light. "Don't," Nina said. "It is possible to say a word with such exhaustion that it becomes prayer. We leave now." Jordan stood behind her with both hands on his head the way kids are told to do in tornado drills. Eli, who forgets he exists when the frame is good, had his eyes shut to the viewfinder as if the only workable world was a world in which the image was smaller, containable, manipulable by focus and f-stop. "One shot," he said, and the words were the single worst set of words we could have given to the waiting thing behind the panel. The flash went off. It wasn't much, just the nervous battery strobe we used to bully shadows into giving up their borders. But the light did not stop at the surface of the panel. It went in like a coin down a well. In the instant of that inwardness, the panel showed depth, and in the depth I saw, no. I felt what light showed when it had to translate itself into touch. There were faces in there. Not faces like portraits, planes, hollows, the topography of bone arranged in rows, the impression of kneeling, not in worship but in work, a congregation at labor, and the labor was this. They were keeping count with their mouths. They were counting by twos, in, hold, out, hold, even stones of breath stacking a wall. Every time I had heard the toll, it had marked the places where breath must be held, where a syllable sat. A pattern that conceded nothing to desire. Warning isn't a message, it's an action. It has to be performed to exist. The flash died. It had been a second at most, but all of us had backed away except Eli, whose finger was white-knuckled on the shutter button like a man pressing a wound. "Did you see?" he said, and couldn't finish because finishing would make it a story, and a story is a trap. Once it exists, you are obligated by it. The prayers were not only clearer, I could hear deep in them the slippage of other prayers that had once been spoken here, other evenings, other inventories of fear. They had been never blessings. They had always been the recitation of offense, the warning against a thing behind the wood. Not against us? "For us, out," Nina said, and I went. Jordan went. He moved with a stiff marionette jerk of the legs as if he had been standing too long in the cold. Eli came last. Not because he wanted to, but because the camera strap caught on a splinter and he had to unloop it like a choke chain. In the yard, the air felt as if it had been used up. We stood there with our hands at our sides like school kids called before a principal. "We leave," Nina said. "Now, no midnight." She said it like a plan that could be kept by the force of a living voice. We loaded the truck in a clutch. The cooler thumped into place. The tripod went under the duffel. I folded the camp chairs in one movement and felt proud of a strength that was entirely the body's trick on the mind. Eli sat in the passenger seat and plugged in his hard drive to copy the files as if, even now, the world of bits could be made to adjudicate the world of breath. The truck tried to start and failed. It tried again. The cough it gave sounded like someone who has drunk smoke. "Battery," Jordan said. We had used more of it than we meant to. He popped the hood. We said things like, "Give it a second and let it sit," because saying is a way of holding back a larger quiet. While we waited, I found myself whispering. It was low. It was habit. It was the half voice you use when you are trying not to intrude on a conversation you're not part of. The words weren't words. They were the shapes the prayers made, the timing of them. I realized after a minute that Nina was doing it too. Not the same syllables as mine, but the same scaffolding. "Stop," she said to herself when she noticed, and then to me, "Stop." Telling a body to stop a rhythm it has learned is like telling the sea to forget the shore. We shut our mouths and breathed until our breaths didn't find the pattern by themselves anymore. We got the truck started on the next try. The sun had begun to squeeze down again, a coin you can never catch before it falls. The road back to the highway was just 2 ruts, but we had made them ourselves on the way in, and so it should have been easy to follow them out. It was not. We overshot a turn we didn't remember making, and came at a wash from an angle that made no sense. The town hung at our right when it should have been behind. I watched a sagebrush with a torn feed bag snagged on it pass 3 times in the window, and knew it only because of the way the bag had torn. The letter R in farm kept trying to stand up and becoming instead a lean-to. We weren't lost. We were being held. The prayers do not need walls to make a fence. They make their own. "Stop the truck," Nina said. Jordan did. All of us sat there without talking while the engine ticked and the day put us in its pocket. Night came like a decision made elsewhere. We did not set up the chairs. We did not light the stove. We sat in the cab with the windows down and watched the church as if it might cross the distance on its own legs. When the bell tolled, I felt relief so profound it embarrassed me. Relief is the body's way of grading obedience. 12 strokes patient exact. On the 6th, without planning, all 4 of us matched the inward hold with our breath. On the 8th, we did it again. On the 10th, my mouth made a shape it had no right to know. By the time the prayers began, they were a language we could borrow. Borrow, not own. We kept our voices closed, but inside the skull there are halls long enough to echo. Something moved behind the panel. Not hands. The absence of hands. The old congregation, whatever had once taken up the work, thinned like smoke. Not abandoning. Making room. No one asked us if we wanted the task. Warnings are not courted. They conscript. Eli held the camera to his chest as if it were an infant too frail for the wind. They had not meant to stop in Belmont at all. A wrong turn off US 6, a bathroom emergency from the youngest, a shrug from the father behind the wheel, and the minivan rolled between crumbled stone buildings that leaned like ancient teeth against a blue, breathless sky. The GPS stuttered and went blank. Heat pressed its palm to the glass and smeared the world. Sagebrush huddled around the road, gray-green and brittle. There was no sound except the ticking of the engine and, beneath it, a silence so heavy that the first door slam sounded like a shot. The family stepped into that silence like waders into black water. Maria sliding sunglasses up the bridge of her nose. Tom stretching his lower back until it cracked. Eli hopping from foot to foot because he had to pee now. And June, 15 in vinegar, already thumbing her phone with a swiftness that suggested none of this was happening to her at all. Belmont did not greet them. It did not need to. Its welcome lay in the way the sun had baked its stones until they kept their heat after dark, in how every wall ended in the teeth of an old fracture, in the windless stillness that kept hanging dust unfallen. A courthouse waited at the end of the main track, roofless and solemn, its arched windows like empty eye sockets. A smattering of chimneys stood with no houses attached, soot throats to nowhere. The air carried the thin, ghosted smell of dry sage and the warmer hint of baking metal from the car. Tom pointed at a placard half swallowed by tumbleweeds, but the letters had faded to the color of old bone. Benton County Courthouse, he guessed aloud. Or something like it. One of those places they built big while hope was still cheap. What are we doing here? June asked without looking up. Can we at least find like an actual bathroom? There's a pit toilet by the trailhead, Maria said, which made Eli go pale and devout. They wandered. The silence pressed inward, so complete that their footsteps on dust sounded indecently loud. When Eli darted behind a low wall and came back buttoning his shorts, he looked smaller, as if the stillness had shaved some volume off him. They moved cautious without deciding to, lowering their voices, stepping around patches of shade as if they were softer, more dangerous ground. Tom ran his fingers across a seam of mortar and brought them away the color of ash. He used to like places like this before the kids. Old mining towns that failed and fell back into the desert like a dream the land had to shake off. He liked to put his ear to the wind and pretend he could hear the clink of rock against pick. The murmur of a bar where the liquor was just something clear and the laughs were paid for by the poor. He did not have to pretend here. From somewhere not far and not near at all came the faint, regular sound of metal tapping stone. It was not the bright chime of a hammer nor the gong of a bell, but something steady and patient. A chisel whispering to a wall. Tom stood still. Maria felt it too. Her fingers tightened briefly around his wrist before she made herself let go. June looked up then. Finally dislodged from the thin membrane of Wi-Fi she had been trying to stretch over the void. "What is that?" she asked. "Construction," Tom said. "Because fathers are required by law to launder fear into facts. Maybe maintenance. Someone must still care for the park. Let's head back. It's too hot." They returned by a different line without choosing it, the way water does. The minivan had turned dull with dust. Heat trembled above the hood. Something about the way the sun was sliding down the least little bit, just enough to change the angle of shadows to sharpen them, made Maria hurry them along without seeming to. She opened the cooler, handed out warm water bottles, made sounds about staying hydrated that her children heard and did not hear. June took a picture of a wall that looked like a broken tooth against the sky, and when she glanced down to see if it had taken, she sucked in a quick breath. "What?" Tom asked. "Battery dead?" "The picture," she said softly. "It's weird." He took the phone. The wall was there, yes, but the space behind it was darker than any shadow should be in that noonday glare. The hole a chalky black where nothing lived. He closed the photo and the darkness vanished. He told himself he had simply shaded the lens with his hand by accident. He did not hand the phone back. No one said they would stay until dusk, but there are hours that slide when you are distracted, and the desert has a way of lengthening and shortening them like taffy. Shadows stretched their legs down the road and lay there motionless. The clink of metal on rock kept time with the slow tilt of the sun. Tom suggested one more walk around the courthouse, and they went because saying no had begun to feel rude. It was cooler now, a deceitful kind of relief, the kind that smells like sage and something mineral and clean. When they reached the arched windows and looked in, they saw only sky framed by stone. Eli boosted himself onto a ledge and came down with chalk on his palms. "Feels like bones," he said. "Okay," Maria said, crisp the way a mother gets when the world feels slippery. "Let's go. It's getting late." They packed in a hurried way that is not really a hurry at all. The way you do when there is no known threat except the feeling that the desert is counting. Tom tossed a map on the back seat that the wind picked up immediately and slapped around like a small fish. June climbed in and shut the door and then opened it again because she thought she'd heard something. She stood with one foot planted on the dirt and the other inside the van and turned her head the way a deer does when it hears the dry crack of a twig. The sound had stopped. It had been footsteps in dust close. She put both feet outside and then stepped back in because the silence swelled as if it were a lung-drawing breath. They drove to the edge of town and realized that the road looked the same whichever way they faced. Sun slid down the slope of the sky and went hiding behind the ridge. The desert exhaled cold. Maria said, "We'll set up here and leave at first light. There's no point getting lost in the dark." Tom agreed before he could decide whether he meant it, because he had already discovered a new sound stitched into the silence. A faint shushing like someone moving their feet very slowly through dust. It was the first noise they had heard that could have been made by another living thing, and that made it worse. They ate granola bars without appetite and drank juice the color of weak blood. Tom sat in the driver's seat with the window cracked and watched the world flatten. The wind that had been absent all day stayed absent, and the sage stood still in its gray bunches. The sky went bruise-colored. June lay across the middle row with her earphones in, but no sound playing. Eli murmured in his sleep like a radio being tuned between stations. Maria wrote things in the small notebook she kept for lists because the act of ordering words soothed her. She wrote, "Leave early, gas at Tonopah. Remind Eli's teacher about inhaler." Then she wrote, "Sound? Footsteps? Nonsense," and scratched over it until the paper tore. She woke in the full black when Tom's hand found her shoulder and pressed. He was staring out the windshield with the fixed calm of a man who has chosen quiet over screaming. "Don't turn on the dome light," he whispered. "Just look, they were not alone." The dust around the minivan had been scuffed into loops and circles and lines like cursive invented by a child. Bare feet had made them. Heel ball toe, the arch narrow as a palm. No shoe tread, no dog claw, no dragging scrape. Every track shone wet in the weak light because something about the night made them hold their shape and their shine, as if each had just been pressed. The circles around the van were close enough to touch the tires and then wider still. They were not random. They were careful. They had been made solemnly like a ritual. "June," Maria said, and June was already awake though she had made no sound. In the rear, Eli breathed through a thin whistle of dried snot. "Is someone messing with us?" June asked, and no one answered. Tom rolled the window up the last inch without meaning to. He turned the key. The engine did not catch because he had meant only to stop the silence from touching them. He tried again and told himself he was embarrassed by the sound the starter made. On the third try, the engine turned and held. They sat with it idling while the prince ringed them like a long, patient sentence that kept looping back to whisper the same word. "Maybe we should honk," Maria said. Tom honked. The sound went outward in a far, thin sheet and did not come back. They waited. The silence that followed was deeper than the one that came before. Then, from the blind space behind the rear bumper came the soft, deliberate pressing of a foot into dust. It made a sound like a sigh. Eli woke with a small cry and sat up, and there was a footprint beneath his window that had not been there before, the toes slightly splayed, the weight more heel than ball, as if the owner of the foot had been leaning back with the kind of patience that is older than time. They drove then. Of course they did. The circles broke like unbraided hair beneath the tires. They tore themselves free and ran the way you can run in first gear over rutted ground. A kind of juddering flight that rattles coughs out of the engine and shakes prayer loose from your ribs. The headlights were a tunnel of white that ended 3 car lengths ahead. The courthouse, the chimneys, the ghost walls slid past like pages. They hit the road proper because the tires stopped complaining. And they drove until the van's breath evened and Maria said, "Okay," in a voice that was meant to be sensible and sounded like a thin string being drawn across a bow. They pulled off a half-mile beyond town and turned the van to face the road back. They told themselves they were making sure no one followed. They told themselves they were watching the dawn when it came, so they could go safely. But they were waiting. The desert knows how to teach waiting. The sky lightened from black to gray to a pale blue that looked like something lived underneath it. The cold retreated, leaving behind a filigree of frost on the edges of shadow. Somewhere out there, a crow called, and the sound snapped like a twig in the quiet. "No one," Tom said softly, and then he saw the line. It came out of Belmont like a signature and stretched toward them in a patient march. Not prints all at once, but footprints appearing one by one, heel then ball then toe, as if pressed by invisible bodies taking cautious steps. The line was not straight. It wavered where the ground softened into wash and split around a scrub of sage, and kissed itself back together on the other side like lips. It did not hurry. It did not falter. It was not until it had come within 20 yards of the van that they saw a second line peel off from the first and wander away into the empty scrubland, as though something had changed its mind mid-step and decided the desert looked more welcoming that way. "We should go," Maria said. Tom put the van in gear and then paused because the prints had begun to curve, not toward them now, but around them. And there was a practical problem. To move forward, he would need to drive over them to test the question no one wanted to ask, which was whether the prints were only marks or whether they were tied to the thing that made them in the way a shadow is tied to a man. He eased the van ahead. The tires bit dust. The prints held. When the bumper crossed the line, the newest print deepened, as if the foot that pressed it leaned its weight, and the air filled for an unmeasurable instant with the smell of wet stone and a sweetness like rotting sage. They stopped. The engine rattled. Eli began to cry. June said, "It's a prank." Maria said, "From who?" That was when the wind rose all at once and then settled, the way a crowd does when a speaker steps up to a microphone. The prints changed direction. They pivoted without breaking stride and began to lead away from the car in a long, sure path into the desert. The first in the line pointed like a compass needle toward the horizon where morning was lifting itself on thin arms. "Maybe they want us to follow," Tom said, and he was aware of how insane that sounded even as his mouth made it. He was also aware of how human it felt. The desire to turn the unknowable into a request, to pretend that if there is a line it must want to be walked. No one answered him. The door handle felt cold in his hand. He opened the door before he remembered he had not meant to. The air outside was the temperature of an apology. It carried the dry sage smell that had lived under everything since they arrived, and beneath that, a hint of iron as if a penny had been held on the tongue too long. He took one step and then another, and the crunch of dust under his shoe was so loud it erased thought. The line of footprints adjusted. It made room. It bent itself a little closer to the van and then angled away again, the way a host might shift to keep a nervous guest included. Tom stopped with the toe of his boot in the heel of the latest print. It was the size of his foot, but not shaped like it. The arch was wrong, flatter and longer. The toes were narrow and seemed to curl as if seeking purchase in a place where nothing ever held. He thought of the sound of metal tapping rock that had kept time with the sun yesterday, and felt how the silence now felt full of the memory of that sound, like a high ringing you hear when a bell stops. He looked back. Maria had not moved. Eli had one hand fisted in his mother's shirt. June had her phone raised, and in the screen there was a shape where Tom stood, not beside him but cast from him, a paler darkness on the ground that was not the shape of his body. June lowered the phone. The shape was gone because the screen was gone. "Don't," Maria said, and in the single syllable there was everything a life together collects. Vows, unfinished arguments, the twin weights of love and fear. Tom lifted his hands, palms out, to show he was not taking another step without saying so. Then Eli said, "They're on my side," in a small voice. And they were. The prints had come around to the passenger door and were leaning inward, as if to listen. They drove in daylight because daylight was supposed to make the world honest. The line ahead of them kept its pace. It did not tire because there was nothing to tire. If they stayed 15 yards behind, it stayed 15 ahead. If they sped up, it hummed along quicker. The prints not exactly appearing faster, but arriving in a way that suggested the thing making them had changed the length of its stride. They tried to veer off the road and go around. The line curved, matching them. Once, when Maria shouted that this was absurd and irrational and entirely unacceptable, and grabbed the wheel like a woman pulling a child back from traffic, the van slewed and spat dust and stopped facing the other way. The line had already uncoiled itself and lay patient now in front of the hood, like a leash of pale steps waiting for a hand. It led them to a place where the scrub fell away to a low plain stippled with salt pan. The earth there had been scraped clean by wind or time. The line made by the invisible walkers went straight into that open, and another line wandered off to the right. A meandering, playful path that looked like the trail of something that did not mind being lost. And there on the salt stood others. Tom did not see them the way you see a man in a room. He saw the place where they were thinner than the air around them, where the light did not quite bounce, where the horizon line behind them looked bent the way a road looks in heat. There were 6 or 8 or more in a kind of loose company, some near, some farther, all facing the minivan, though none had faces to speak of. The prints that had led them here ended at the front of the thin congregation and began again behind them, as if each figure stood in its own loop of walking. "Get in the back," Maria said to the kids, though they were already there. Tom reached for her hand and held it and felt how quickly her pulse was going and how steady. "What do they want?" June whispered. Which is the question we ask of everything that frightens us, because wanting is a human verb and easier to forgive. No one said the other possibility aloud, that the figures did not want anything human at all, only balance. A new set of footprints appeared just in front of the bumper. They were smaller, lighter, the heel pressed as if out of habit rather than weight. Whoever made them had walked barefoot a long time. The toes separated and turned only a little, like a dancer's feet. The prints led away into the flat like thread unspooling from a spool. Tom felt the tug in his chest the way a fish must feel the tug when the line goes tight. He did not move. He would have said he had learned something about himself in that second, that he was brave, that he was steady. But the truth was he simply could not quite think because the silence had thickened until it had weight. And in that weight he could not remember the number of letters in his own name. The smallest print stopped. It rotated, the toes turning as if the owner had turned to look back. Behind it, June's breath caught at the same moment. She had taken another photo without realizing she'd raised the phone, and the screen showed what the eye refused. A narrow, pale face, almost the right shape, but with eyes too far apart and too patient, the edges of it smearing into the air. The mouth was not a mouth, but a crack in light. Then the screen went black because the phone had finally given up. June made a small unhappy noise deep in her throat that was not fear exactly, but the sound sadness makes when it remembers itself. "We are not following," Maria said in a voice that had grown taller in the last hour, and Tom had the absurd thought that if he were one of the thin figures out there, he would listen to that voice. The prints did not. They began again. The small ones led away into the scrub that began after the salt pan, over the low rise where the land's ribs showed. The others did not move. They waited, because waiting is what the desert does best, and the living always need more time than the dead. Tom put the van in reverse because the human heart keeps the oldest commandments first. The tires spun, bit, grabbed. The van backed up a yard and stopped against nothing you could see but which held as if it were a fence. He tried again and felt the rear lift a fraction, then settle into place as if set down gently by someone large. He shifted to drive. The line of prints in front of him brightened. No, not brightened, simply grew darker against the dust, fresher as if some hand had gone over them with a finger. He took his foot off the brake and sat with the van idling, sweating in the cold air, feeling the earth, which had felt like bone all morning, soften underneath thought. Eli unbuckled. He did it while looking at Tom, the way a child does when he is either about to show you his bravery or a wound you did not know he had. "I'll be quick," he said, and Tom heard his son's voice in the silence the way you hear music through a wall. "No," Tom said, "because no is what you learn first and what you trust last." Eli put his hand on the handle and paused at the sound of Maria's breath tearing in. He looked at the prints ahead and at the smaller line that had gone over the rise. He said, "They're lonely." It would be easy to blame what happened next on something outside them. That is the polite myth Belmont is built to sell to anyone who walks its empty streets. The dead already decided, the living only enduring. But there was a shape inside the four of them that matched the shapes on the salt, the way a mold matches the thing it was made from. Tom opened his door. He did it because he could not stand to see the small prince go unaccompanied, because his son had said the word lonely, in a voice that made the letter O into a moon. Maria reached for him and missed. June said something that was mostly his name and mostly a sound birds make when a shadow passes over them. Tom put his foot down in dust. The figures did not rush. They did not drag. They did not have to. They shifted a little, an allowance made. Tom walked one step and another and felt the crunch of ancient dust under his heel and under his toes, and felt how the sound of it went right up through him like a current. The small line bent a fraction, welcoming. He went over the rise, and for a moment the van vanished from him, and he was alone with sky and sage. The smell of dry green was the whole world. He thought he heard the soft strike of pictostone far below the ground and wondered if there was a ladder down there somewhere, and if he would know it when he saw it. Maria followed. She did not know she had begun to. That is how the desert takes you. Not with drama, not with a scream or a rope from the sky, but the way heat takes water, a little at a time. She put her foot down and found it had already made a sound as if it had been waiting for the weight. June did not move because someone had to hold the line that tied all of them back to something like a house and a morning that began without fear. She grabbed Eli's arm, and Eli's arm felt like a bird in her hand, rigid with the urge to fly against the palm that would keep it safe. They went a little way. The van idled. The figures on the salt did nothing that a camera would catch. The first of the small prints deepened and darkened and then lightened again as if something had lifted off it. Tom heard a voice that sounded like someone whispering from the bottom of a well. It said a word he could not make out. It said his name with too many letters in it. He kept walking because he had already taken the first steps, and in all stories that matter, the first steps are the expensive ones. June let go. She did it because Eli had to pee again and because she had lived her whole life believing that nothing real could want anything from her if she refused it hard enough. Eli took 2 steps and the line opened for him, the way water opens for a hand. He looked very small then, even smaller than he had looked when the silence first took volume from him. The prince curved toward him, and June snatched him back by the collar and slapped the side of his head lightly with the flat of her hand. Not out of anger, but because touch is the only prayer that feels like something you can do. He cried because she had hit him, and she cried because she had not meant to, and the desert listened and did not care. Tom stopped on the far side of the rise and turned. He was not far. He could still see the van. He could see Maria's hair like fire in the pale sun, and June's black shirt and Eli's flushed face. He could see all of them and knew they could see him. He lifted a hand. The prints around his feet deepened as if applauding. He smiled a little, the way a man smiles when he intends to make a joke of something he can feel circling his throat. Then the ground under him shifted the way ground sometimes does when a sinkhole sighs in its sleep, and he dropped a half inch, and the prince changed shape to hold him. He tried to lift his foot and could not because anything bound him, but because the dust had learned his weight and adjusted itself. And how do you argue with a ground that has learned your exact name? "I'm fine," he said. And the words sounded wrong because the desert had held too many of them and their edges had worn down. He leaned forward and did not move. Maria reached him in 3 strides that were like running and like waiting at once. She took his arm, and when she did, the world decided there were 2 of him now, and the prince obligingly made room for this news. For a second, they all teetered on the edge of a ridiculous vaudeville, the minivan idling, the salt speckled with thin knot shadows watching, a mother and father frozen ankle-deep in dust while a teenager and a boy cried and hiccuped beside a cooler packed with juice. It would make a poor ending to say that something violent happened then. It would be wrong, and Belmont has always preferred true cruelty to false drama. What happened was that Tom leaned again and the dust released him because he had stopped arguing with it. He stepped free sideways, not forward, and the prints rearranged themselves with the contented hum of chairs being pulled back in an empty church. Maria let go and stepped after him, and for a moment they were both on ground that had not learned them yet. They turned together as if against a tide and walked back with steps that tried to be casual and landed like hammer blows. They reached the van. The figures on the salt did not follow because there are terms even curses must keep if they wish to last. The small line continued away over the rise and down again, patient and cheerful as a road. The larger line that had come from Belmont began to fill in from behind, each old print freshening in place as if the walkers had decided to be thorough. Tom closed his door. Maria closed hers. June pulled Eli into her lap the way she had when he was little and his legs fit then. They sat and waited for something as large and simple as a bell, and when nothing came, they did the only thing anyone has ever done when the dead ask you for your weight. They left, not in flight, but in a slow dignity that felt borrowed, following the thin black ribbon of road that led toward towns that had never had their names broken out of rock. When they looked back, because all stories require that you look back, the figures were a suggestion against the pale, and the lines were still being made with the same patient certainty. The prints near the courthouse were new again. The circles around where the minivan had been were clearer than before, their edges sharp as if cut, as if the desert had learned how to trace them better with practice. The wind never rose. The sage never bent. The sun climbed with an expressionless face. The sound of metal on rock came once, faint and exact, and then not again for a while. They reached Tonopah by noon. Nobody spoke. The gas station was busy with normal human errands. The crackle of plastic, the beep of registers, the shh of soda fountains, the whole world saying yes to itself in small mechanical ways. Tom pumped gas and watched dust lift and fall off the pavement in the heat. Maria went into the bathroom with a look on her face like a woman rehearsing a story about how a child has been sick, so that the attendant will be kind. June stood with her back against the ice chest and stared north toward a place she could not see. Eli folded his arms and set his jaw and did not cry. When they got back into the van, there was dust on the floor mats in two careful crescents that had not been there before. They looked like commas in a sentence that asked a question no one wanted to answer. Tom wiped them away with the heel of his hand harder than he meant to. He drove south. He did not look at the rearview mirror because the desert was in it and always would be. They went on for an hour before anyone said anything. When Maria finally spoke, it was the beginning of an ordinary logistics conversation about miles and snacks and where to stop next. Her voice sounded almost normal. The road unspooled and the world made room. That night, in a motel too new to have a voice yet, the kids fell asleep with the TV low. Maria showered and rubbed lotion into skin that felt thinner than before. Tom stood by the window and stared out at the parking lot's rectangles of light. He thought of the prints at the courthouse and the circles around the van and the line that led away, and he understood something that had not been his to know. That numbers need balancing. That a ledger is a kind of prayer if you say it long enough. That what the desert drags back to itself is not a person but a weight, a step, a measure. He was almost asleep when he heard it through the thin wall and the humming air conditioner, not from outside but from underneath and a long, long way away. Metal against rock, patient as breathing. He pressed his palm to the carpet and felt the slightest answering tap travel up through his bones like a greeting. In the morning, the air outside the motel smelled faintly of sage, though there was none growing for miles, and the van's windshield wore a diagonal grit that looked like finger tracks drawn across sleep. June took a photo and did not look at it. Eli asked for pancakes. Maria said yes. They went to a diner where the waitress called everyone honey and the sugar came in a metal pourer cold from the fridge. The world attempted to be ordinary and the world mostly succeeded. It always does. But when they came out, there were damp, fresh prints on the sidewalk where the shade still held. A single set of bare feet walking away toward the desert. They led nowhere, of course, because cities learn how to swallow such lines whole. But for a second they stood there and it was Belmont again. The smell of dry sage, the stillness that makes your own breath sound loud, the patient invitation of a path that extends exactly as far as you can imagine. They left, they drove home. They did not speak of it to anyone because there is a kind of story that makes people back up with their hands lifted, laughing. Tom went back to work. Maria wrote new lists that did not tear. June scrolled to the photo of the split dark and deleted it, and then woke 2 nights later with the memory of the shape of a mouth that was not a mouth and sat awake until dawn tasting iron. Eli drew footprints in the margins of his homework with a yellow pencil and erased them before anyone could see. The dust in their garage lay undisturbed until one morning when the door rose to let light fall, and there, softly written in that light, were prints leading from the threshold to the far wall and then back again, as if someone had come in and decided not to stay. This is how the arithmetic is kept. The desert is wide and exacting, and Belmont is only one of the towns that set their stones and then carried them away again. There are others that never bother pretending to be quaint. The numbers are never right long. The living will always be born too fast. The dead will always be held too long in places where the sage smells like a memory, and the air listens as if paid. Sometimes a family stops in a place where there is no sound but the crunch of dust underfoot, and the faint, respectable tapping of metal on rock far below. Sometimes they are very lucky and drive away with nothing more than a sense that their weight has been measured and recorded, and not yet collected. Sometimes the small prints that lead away are a little too close to the size of a child's foot to ignore. And sometimes, years later, when the ledger needs straightening and the patient arithmetic looks up from its page, a man hears a sound through his cheap carpets like a tap, tap, tap. A woman smells sage while standing in a city train. A teenager glances down at a sidewalk and sees a line of bare prints that lead into sun glare. A child wakes to find the faintest curve of dust at the side of his bed. They hold still. They listen. The prints do not hurry. They do not plead. They simply point into the open. The desert, which is not a place but a practice, waits. The living, which is only a temporary wait, rises and gathers itself and makes a sound like a foot pressed into dust, and the line begins again.